Hello and welcome. It's a confusing time for Israelis. The country's elections have ended in a painful stalemate. Peace prospects with the Palestinians are at an incredible low. Divisions within society are more evident, and the sense of direction for the future overall seems a bit more foggy. On the political front, Israel's President Shimon Peres held talks with party leaders on Wednesday as he considers whom to ask to try to form a new government. It's up to Mr. Peres to decide which leader is best suited to form a ruling coalition and would serve Israel's best interests. As far as peace efforts, the ongoing Israel-Gaza truce negotiations have reached a sticking point over the release of an Israeli prisoner being held by Hamas. What effect is all of this tension having on the psyche of the nation? That's something my guest can touch on as he joins me from London. Amos is one of Israel's leading authors and commentators, speaking out on everything from the prospect of real peace to how Israeli society is evolving. He's won multiple awards for his prolific work and is one of Israel's most influential writers. His latest novel, Rhyming Life and Death, was published earlier this month, exploring the fertile imagination of an author as he interacts with those around him. Remember, you can join our conversation with Amos as we take your questions and comments. Log on to livestation.com/AJE, enter the chat room, and then take part. And we also welcome your phone calls to our guest. Amos, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. I want to ask you, first of all, how you regard the current situation in Israel's political landscape, the deadlock that seems to exist. Judging by the way the vote turned out, Israelis didn't seem to know where to cast their vote. And I wonder if there's still a clear sense of left and right-wing politics in Israel.
Well, Israel is divided. It has always been divided. That's not a new phenomenon in Israeli politics or in Israeli reality. In fact, you never get two Israelis to agree with each other on anything. It's hard to get even one to agree with himself or herself. But essentially, I believe the vast majority of the Israelis are ready for a livable compromise with the Palestinians. They are not happy with the idea of a compromise with the Palestinians. They will not be dancing in the streets when such a compromise is implemented, but deep down in their heart of hearts, the majority of the Israelis know that in the end of the day there will be a compromise with the Palestinians.
So how do you explain what seems to be a strong shift towards the hardliners, though, towards the right?
Well, 3 years ago, Israel evacuated Gaza and handed it over to the Palestinians. There was no Hamas at this time in control in Gaza. Israel removed by force 26 Israeli settlements. The Israelis expected, in return for the evacuation of Gaza, some peace and quiet coming from Gaza and perhaps some progress in the entire process of the peace. Instead, what came was a rain of rockets on Israeli towns and villages, which for years had to suffer rocket attacks. No wonder many of the Israelis hardened and became more pessimistic and more right-wing.
But in terms of the way that the voters have cast their votes, it seems that they seem to expect some sort of action. There's also the interesting point that Arabs in Israel who make up about a fifth of the population, they seem to have very little voice in what's going on as well. So I wonder how society is going to shape itself once a ruling coalition is formed.
I think we are going to have a shaking coalition. Probably it's going to be either a right and far-right coalition or a right-wing center coalition, and I hope it will be a right-wing center coalition. Now, this is not necessarily the end of the world, because in the past, right-wing governments in Israel made considerable concessions for peace. Let's not forget that it was the right-wing Menachem Begin who gave back the whole of Sinai to Egypt in return for a peace treaty, and it was Ariel Sharon, of all people, who evacuated Gaza in the hope of peace.
Let me ask you about how you view the regard that many Jews who live outside Israel are a lot more hardline and perhaps Zionistic in their views than those living in Israel itself, that perhaps those who are in the region have a much better sense of the realities and are less romantic about the idea of what Israel might be. Do you find that to be the case at all?
Yes, to some extent this is the case, but it's easy enough to be hardline pro-Israel when you live away from the arena and away from reality, and you are fed by slogans.
We had an interesting email that came from London, if I may put this to you, from a viewer who was watching in the UK. Harfia in London says, both Jews and Palestinians seem to do well in other countries throughout the world when they let go of their attachment to bits of land. I wonder what that says for, I guess, how surreal the environment might be actually living in the Middle East, in the middle of it all.
Well, it's a disputed land. Let us not forget for a moment that the disputed land is a site of a colossal tragedy. The Palestinians have no other land but Palestine. They are in Palestine for the same reason for which the Norwegians are in Norway. The Israeli Jews are in Israel for exactly the same reason. They have no other land either. This provides for a fair understanding between the party and for a terrible tragedy. The only solution to such a tragedy is a livable compromise.
The impression I get talking to a lot of Israelis, and I know, is that those who've been there a long time or are settled there, have been settled for a long time, seem to be more pragmatic about how they might move forward. Whereas perhaps the hardliners are some of the newer settlers, the newer people coming in. How are you finding divisions in society along those lines? Who the hardliners are and who those are more pragmatic?
Many of the hardliners are newcomers, and many of the newcomers are hardliners. This is perhaps understandable up to a point. An immigrant, a new immigrant in every country, tends to be more patriotic or more in a need to prove his or her patriotism than an old-timer.
We had an email that came from Lincolnshire in the UK. Peter Brown wrote in saying, the tragedy is that every possible excuse is being used to avoid meaningful negotiations to achieve a two-state solution with a viable Palestine. The war against Gaza showed the world that Israel is prepared to kill large numbers of civilians to defend its occupation. I know you initially supported the attacks on Gaza. What was it that made you turn your opinion and comment more critically on it?
No, that's not precise. What I supported was a very limited measure and not a full-scale war, certainly not a land operation against Gaza. Well, I live in the Negev, in the south of Israel, and the Negev region received about 10,000 Palestinian rockets from Hamas over the last few years. I doubt it that any country in the world would have turned the other cheek to such an attack. So Israel was right to respond militarily, but it was wrong in the excessiveness and the exaggeration of its response.
I've got a caller on the line from the United Arab Emirates. Mohammed, good to have you with us. Mohammed, what would you like to ask?
Hi, good evening.
Good evening.
I
Good evening.
basically heard a couple of comments being made by the guest saying that when Israel supposedly withdrew from Gaza, that they were expecting some peace and quiet. I mean, it's hard to imagine that. I mean, how can not people see that there was an 18-month blockade on Gaza that existed there, which ultimately caused the rockets to be fired in the first place? That's point one. Point two, in Israel itself and in the West Bank, we have an apartheid regime that is continuously expanding settlements, disenfranchising the supposed Arab Israeli population, which is in fact originally Palestinians. So how do you explain that? There's an occupation, there's a racist state, and there's ultimately a blockade still existing on the Gaza Strip.
Mr. Oz.
Yes, point one, the blockade is not the reason but a result of the rocket attack on Israel. And secondly, I don't understand the term blockade. Gaza borders with Egypt, and through Egypt with the rest of the Arab world. There could have been a stream of supplies from Egypt and from the whole Arab world to Gaza. There could have been an all-Arab effort to raise the standard of living in Gaza. There could have been a far-reaching Arab investment in Gaza. After all, Gaza is no longer a part of Israel. As for the second point, I think apartheid is abhorrent, and I think describing Israel as a land of apartheid is very one-sided. Israel has its flaws, and the lasting occupation of the West Bank is unjustifiable. Nonetheless, unlike apartheid, it's not based on race. It's a result of a lasting conflict, and actually the Israeli oppression and occupation, which I resent, is a result of a lasting Arab attempt and Palestinian attempt to throw Israel into the ocean. In short, it's not black and white. It's not about good guys and bad guys. It's a tragedy. It's a clash between right, and recently it's a clash between wrong and wrong.
Isn't there a general feeling now, though, Mr. Oz, that most of the Arab world has accepted Israel is going to exist, that there is a prospect for Israel to have some kind of peace process with partners as opposed to direct enemies?
I think Israel should accept the Arab League proposal as a basis for negotiation. I think Israel have accepted it as a basis for negotiation, and there is no justification to the fact that the negotiation between the Israelis and the Palestinians has been dragging its feet for 2 years now, or 3 years. I think the bottom line of this negotiation is well known both to Israelis and to the Palestinians. There will be a viable Palestinian state on the West Bank in Gaza next door to Israel, and they will live like neighbors, not necessarily like lovers.
When you express your concerns with the way Israel has behaved in certain aspects, and you show dissent, how are you regarded? How easy is it to express dissent for what Israel does in certain quarters?
Well, I get a lot of hate mail in Israel. I get some threats from time to time, but nobody ever tried to censor me. It's an open society. One can scream in the tops of one voice. You know, it's very common in Israel for prime ministers to invite poets and writers for a soul-searching tete-a-tete. I had the dubious experience with almost every Israeli prime minister in the last 30 years. And the prime minister invites you to his or her home, gives you a cup of tea or a drink, depending on who you are or who the prime minister is, listening to your wisdom, praising your language, admiring your words, and ignoring them completely.
Mr. Ross, we have more questions for you. We're going to take a very short break here. As we go to break, let me remind you that you can take part in the conversation with your questions and comments by logging on to livestation.com and entering the chat room. The debate's taking place there right now. We'll be right back.
Dum